Okay, this is on starts the lymphatic and the immune system. And the main function of the lymphatic and immune system is to protect the body from pathogens which can cause either illness or disease. In addition, it has some other supporting functions, and that is the production of leukocytes, which are lymphocytes, which are white blood cells, so type of white blood cells, the destruction of bacteria, the production of antibodies, returning of fluid and dissolved substances to the blood, and the distribution of hormones, nutrients, and waste products. Now the first three for the lymphatic system are very much their immune role, but they also have these two other roles that don't really have an immunity link, so that's why it's actually called the lymphatic system and not the immunity system. Now with this, we're going to be dealing with the word pathogen quite a bit. And a pathogen is a disease-causing agent, in other words, a foreign invader. And that can include a lot of different things. It can include bacteria, it can include viruses, it can include fungi, as well as parasites such as worms or as protists. Now within the lymphatic system we have several structures that are important, and some of these you may have heard of, but it's one of those things where you may have heard of them but you don't exactly know what they do. The first structure are the lymphatic vessels themselves. Now we hear about blood vessels all the time, and we're familiar with those now, but you don't hear a lot about lymphatic vessels. Lymphatic vessels are specialized vessels that transform a fluid called lymph that we'll talk about here in a minute. Now the walls of the vessels themselves are much more porous, so they allow a lot more things to come into these vessels than blood vessels do, especially these large protein molecules, and we'll talk about why those protein molecules are important here in a little bit. This is a one-way system, so there's a start point and an end point to a lymphatic vessel, and these vessels contain valves to help prevent backflow, so they are very much like our veins. You have to think of it, it's not really tied in with our heart at all, so there's nothing really to pump this fluid. So it's at a very, very low pressure within our lymphatic system. If you look at the diagram here, the green part are actually the lymphatic vessels. So what happens is the blood comes down through the arterioles and then branches off into the capillary bed. It's at this point where we can actually get the movement of fluid out of our blood vessel, out of our capillary, and into the area surrounding the cells. Now, we want this fluid to continue moving, because if we get a buildup of fluid in that area, then that will actually cause swelling of our tissues. So it has to keep moving, but it has to have another vessel to go into. Some of it will actually come back into the capillary here as it starts to go towards the vein end of things, but some of that fluid does need another place to go. So what happens is it actually flows into these green ones here, which are the lymphatic vessels. So this area here is actually kind of like the start of that lymphatic vessel. And you can see the smaller vessels merge and become bigger and bigger as they move away or around through the body, away from that initial capillary bed. Now the fluid that's inside of those is called lymph, and lymph is actually, like I said, the actual fluid, and there's three components to it. There's extra intercellular fluid or interstitial fluid, which comes out of the bloodstream. So it's from the plasma portion of our blood. There's also large protein molecules in there. So that's why it's important for the lymphatic vessels to actually have that. A lot of these protein molecules are ones that are produced by cells, so it's not originally in the bloodstream, but these protein molecules actually act as chemical signals that are detected within the lymph that help us to fight infection. And also, as well, are lymphocytes, those specialized white blood cells, hence their name lymphocyte, because that's where they're located. Now we have several different types of lymphocytes, and we mentioned these a little bit when we talked about the blood. But the first type is the T cells, and those are called T cells because they are thymus dependent. They actually are made initially and then also mature there in our thymus. They directly attack foreign cells or viruses that come into the body. The next type are the B cells, which are the bone marrow derived cells, and they function to create antibodies. The NK cells are the natural killer cells, and they attack foreign cells as well as infected normal cells and cancer cells. So these guys are kind of the cleanup team. Now there's one other kind of lymphocyte, and those are the helper T cells. And these helper T cells are what actually stimulate our T and B cells to work. Now the reason I mention these is they're not really a true lymphocyte necessarily, but these are the cells that are actually targeted by the HIV virus. So I just wanted you guys to kind of understand the context in which that disease kind of fits here with our lymphatic system while we're talking about these cells. Now the lymph itself, the fluid, flows through the lymphatic vessels, and like I said, there is an endpoint to these vessels, and those are the lymphatic and the thoracic ducts. Okay, that is the end of the system itself. What this does is it empties the lymph into our subclavian veins, and these are located literally kind of right below our collarbones in our neck. 3/4 of the lymph enters our thoracic duct, while the other quarter enters the lymphatic duct. So it actually only drains like the upper right quadrant of our body. You can actually see that here. The lymphatic duct only drains basically this side. Now the thoracic duct in theory should only drain this portion here, but what happens is the lymphatic ducts coming from the lymphatic vessels coming from the region below the belly button kind of combine into one on this side and merge to actually get emptied into the thoracic duct. Now, along these vessels are some other specialized structures called lymph nodes, and they function to actually filter our lymph as it moves towards those ducts. Now, this happens kind of continuously because of the porosity of the lymphatic vessels. We have to continually filter it, so it's not the type of thing where we get lymph into the lymphatic vessel and then we don't add any more, so we only have to filter it once. You will see these lymph nodes at multiple places along different lymphatic vessels because as we continue to add lymph, we want to continue filtering. These lymph nodes are found in clusters or groups all along the lymphatic vessels. Now we're not going to actually look at a diagram of that or name them except for the lymphatic and thoracic ducts. Now the lymph nodes function in biological filtration. So inside of them there are phagocytic white blood cells that gobble up the bacteria and pathogens. And what this does is it prevents the bad cells, the pathogens, from actually entering the bloodstream and coming in contact with the heart, which could be a really bad thing. This also helps contain infections as well as cancer cells, helps keep them from spreading. And this is why when people have a biopsy done or a tumor removal or a lump removal done that is cancerous, usually what happens is the doctor also takes some lymph nodes from that particular area. What they're doing is they're going to take apart those lymph nodes and see if there's any cancer cells. If there's cancer cells inside of those lymph nodes, which are called sentinel lymph nodes, because they're kind of standing guard, so to speak, around that cancer tumor, if there's cancer cells present in the nodes, it's an indication that the tumor has metastasized. And if it's metastasized or not metastasized, that is going to actually kind of dictate some of the treatment options for that patient. In addition, the lymph nodes help to form or produce the lymphocytes. The thymus. Now we talked about the thymus in the endocrine system, but this also has some lymphoid function as well. It is made of lymphoid tissue and it's located medially, so down the middle line of the body between the upper portion of the lungs. This is where we get our lymphocytes before we are born. They also play a very important role in the maturation of our T cells. What happens is they mature there and then they circulate to places like the spleen, the tonsils, the lymph nodes, and other lymphatic tissues. Now, in early childhood, by puberty, the function of the thymus is actually completed. And then it undergoes a process called involution, where it stops functioning gradually and gets replaced by fatty tissue over time. We think that this ceasing of the function of the thymus may actually be tied to some of the things that we experience as part of the aging process. Now the next one is something that pretty much all of you are familiar with, and that is are the tonsils. These are again lymphoid tissues that help protect bacteria from invading, especially through the oral or nasal cavities. They are basically a physical barrier, so they actually kind of block, like a goalie, bacteria from coming in. We have 3 sets of tonsils that are involved. The palatine tonsils, and these are the ones that you see when you look in the mirror and you go, ah, you'll see those at the back of your throat. The pharyngeal tonsil is also called the adenoids, and it's near the back opening of the nasal cavity. And the lingual, which are way back behind at the very base of the tongue. And you can see these here on the diagram. Now, oftentimes if little kids have lots of ear infections, they will actually take out this pharyngeal tonsil, because this little opening right there was the opening to the eustachian tubes that lead up into our ears. So if you have an overactive pharyngeal tonsil, which tends to have a lot of bacteria in them, a lot of times that bacteria can actually end up going up those eustachian tubes into the ears and causing ear infections. So some children, when they're young, if they've had a lot of ear infections, one of the things that doctors will do is they'll actually take out their adenoids, their pharyngeal tonsils. Now, the last structure that we want to talk about is the spleen. And the spleen is an organ that has a very rich blood supply. It has about an eighth of our blood supply. A pint, 2 pints to a quart, 4 quarts to a gallon, which is about how much blood volume we have. The spleen itself is located actually on your left side. It kind of cups the end of our stomach, and we'll actually see it on a diagram that we do next week with the digestive system. Now, because it has such a rich blood supply that if we rupture our spleen, we can actually die just from that because of the amount of blood loss that we will experience when that happens. Now, the spleen is something that we all hear about from time to time, so we've at least heard it, but we really don't know what it does. It has 4 main functions. It removes bacteria by filtration as well as phagocytosis. It destroys our worn-out red blood cells. And then it salvages the iron for the red blood cells for reuse. So it sends it back to the red bone marrow to use in new ones. And so as it's destroying worn-out blood cells, about 3 million per second, the red bone marrow is actually releasing 3 million new red blood cells at the same time. And basically that's equivalent to about a drop of blood per second. So 3 million sounds like a lot, but by the same token, it's really not that much because the cells are so small. It does hold a reservoir of blood in case of emergency, so if you suffer a traumatic injury like a gunshot wound or an accidental amputation, the spleen can actually release that pint of blood that it holds onto, and that can actually make the difference for someone between living or dying, until they can get the medical attention that they need. So the spleen actually has a very similar function in some ways to the liver and kidney. And so sometimes people don't understand, well, why do we need the spleen if we've got the liver and the kidney? Well, all 3 of these organs filter the blood, so that's their similarity. But what they filter out of the blood is very different. The kidney filters metabolic waste, so waste that our cells produce get filtered out at the kidney. The liver removes chemicals that don't belong in the body. Now, this can actually be stuff that we purposely put in there, like Tylenol or other prescription medications. But that's one of the reasons why we have to keep retaking that medicine, because after we've taken it, the liver is actually working to get rid of it. And the spleen's function is biological filtration. So those are the structures and the main overview of the lymphatic system. In the next segment, we're going to start talking about the immune system response, and specifically we're going to look at the non-specific response in this one.